If your team's trying to move faster with AI or scale more efficiently without reinventing the wheel, InfoQ Dev Summit Munich 2025, this October 15th and 16th, might help. It's a practical event, talks from people in the trenches, sharing what they've actually shipped, fixed, or learned. No big launches or buzzwords, just useful ideas you can take back to your team the next day. Learn more at devsummit.infoq.com.
Welcome to the Architects Podcast, where we discuss what it means to be an architect and how architects actually do their job. Today's guest is Rashmi Venugopal, who has a track record of building and operating reliable distributed systems which power mission-critical applications at scale. Over the past decade, she has been instrumental in designing and developing complex software systems that enable consumers to effortlessly pay for their subscriptions at Netflix, calculate tiered pricing for various ride options at Uber, and manage Azure cloud networking configurations at Microsoft. With a master's degree in information networking from Carnegie Mellon, Rashmi currently serves as staff software engineer at Netflix. In this role, she leads cross-functional initiatives aimed at driving subscription growth through payment orchestration for over 250 million members. When she's not immersed in code, you'll find her outdoors, either hiking, camping, or at a local park, reflecting on the impact of technology on the world. It's great to have you here on the podcast, and I would like to start out by asking you how your interest in software architecture started. It's not as if you woke up one morning and said, today I'm going to be an architect, today I'm going to do architecture.
Hey, Michael, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to be here. An interesting observation, just based on how you phrased your question around, being an architect, is how less common the title of the architect has become now. That said, the role of the architect is still alive and very much around and relevant for folks in senior or staff plus roles for sure. Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not the case that I woke up one day and decided that I want to be an architect or a staff engineer, which is almost why I feel like my answer here is it was kind of an accident. And what I think I mean by that is that it represents a natural progression in my career rather than like a goal or an end state that I was actively pursuing. It is a function of seeking out new challenges and problems and questions for me to go after personally at like an individual level. But even organizationally, as you move up the proverbial ladder, the open questions that bubble up to you tend to become more complex and nuanced. And it's like, hey, the distributed systems challenges or like software design questions, those are the ones that bubble up to you. And then when you spend more time thinking about that and like living and breathing that stuff, then that's how you, I guess, evolve into the role that I am in today.
Did you ever think at some point, consciously or even unconsciously, that you were at a branch point? In other words, you could have become an architect, but maybe you could have stayed at an individual contributor, or maybe you could have gone off into quality assurance. In other words, this evolution is sort of partly under your control and partly with the opportunities you get or the places you go to seek them out.
Totally. And one branching point that I can think of now that you say it was, hey, did I want to become a manager? Like, did I want to get into people managing? And that was an opportunity that came up in my organization as well. And that had me reflecting deeper, like, hey, where do I find work satisfaction? Like, where does my sense of accomplishment come from? And I made the explicit decision to stay as an individual contributor and not switch into people management.
And no doubt you're happier that you made that decision.
Yes. Like, I'm not saying that that door is closed always.
Right.
But I definitely feel like I made the right decision at that time.
Just thinking about this, and sort of maybe I have a biased perspective on this, you may turn out to be, if you do decide to go down the managerial role, you have a better idea of what your employees are going to go through
Mm,
having done it yourself,
yeah,
as opposed to somebody who just goes straight into the managerial role and does not necessarily understand.
yeah.
So I think the door not being closed, I think you may turn out to be a better manager if you decide to go down that route.
Fair, fair. And like
Yeah.
managers that have, technical expertise, you can actually tell the difference when they're the ones managing versus
Yes.
somebody that doesn't. Yeah.
And hopefully they know enough to ask good questions, but not to dictate to you.
Yeah.
So I've looked over some of the stuff that you've done, and it's been quite interesting. One of the things that I personally have found in my career of doing architecture and working in distributed systems, or even going back to the days of service-oriented architecture, even I'm old enough to remember the client server days. Hopefully I'm not dating myself too much. But one of the biggest problems I have found is that back-end software architects and developers very often view the world very differently from front-end software architectures. And this disconnect can be quite difficult for an architect to grasp. What I mean by this is back-end software architects, and you can tell me whether you think I'm right or wrong about this, obviously, tend to view the world much more in terms of individual events, transactions that we can roll back or compensate for.
Mm,
I remember the days in client server, for example, where very often people use stored procedures, and that had a tremendous example on the front end. The front end engineers think in terms of workflow, how users approach things.
yeah.
So, for example, let's say you have to fill out an application.
Yeah.
You don't have all the information you need right away. Suppose you need the social security number, I don't have it. I need to get some sort of certification.
Mhm.
Don't have that right now. I don't have the bank account number that I need to set up the payments or the credit card number. So if you took a very rigid back-end view of the world and said, well, the database can't have any nulls in it, and we either have this information now or we don't have it at all, from a front end, that's kind of foolish. Now, I think we learned already how to deal with a situation like that, but I think that's sort of a very simple example of this disconnect and the fact that systems that don't resolve this disconnect or handle it well have trouble evolving. And the question is, how can we stop this from happening?
Great question, Michael, and a good one for me, especially as somebody that works in the middle tier. So my team operates between the UI layer and the backend layer. And I view our core capability as translating the APIs that the backend teams provide and generate into packaging them into unified APIs, or like orchestrating between the UI interactions in the backend. And this goes back to this almost a joke that people say that everything can be solved with an added layer of abstraction. So
Right, yes. Yeah.
that's what this has come down to. How do we solve the mismatches, or like the challenges that we have translating UI requirements to backend requirements? Hey, add a layer in the middle, right? So,
If I can inject just a joke for a moment, I've often told people that I've done three things in my software consulting career. One, trade off space and time, insert levels of indirection, and try to get my clients to tell me what they really want.
the third one sounds like UI engineers trying to tell us, hey, this is what we want the user to do.
Yes. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but I that's sort of just, this problem goes back a long way.
Yep. And all those 3 points resonate with me as well. So, in software topology, we have, let's say we have 3 layered system with front end, middle tier, and back end. The layers have separate responsibilities and they all exist for a reason. And traditionally, as you said, backend engineers expose APIs. Each of them are useful and meant to be used in a specific way. The mid tier is an orchestration engine that ties the backend and the front end. They take the backend APIs and package them into atomic operations, and they know how to sequence these API calls based on an action that the user can take. On the front end side, in addition to all the challenges that you already called out with like creating a user workflow, I think our technology landscape has evolved to, now people want to sign up or like fill a form on the TV versus your iPad versus your mobile. And just the presentation challenges can be so different across the platforms. And now we expect our UI teams to be able to serve all types of platforms. So the layers of abstractions are meant to help each of the layers to not think of anything that's not part of their core competency or expertise. That said, if I boil it down to the core responsibilities for each, the way I think of it is, hey, backend is the source of truth for user state and user data. Mid-tier can do, experimentation or like generate data for analytics purposes or provide some sort of standardization across the different operations. And then UI, of course, presentation across different platforms, user feedback, they're optimized for user interactions. But there are, of course, obvious pitfalls that sometimes happen, in the way we operate. What do I, call a pitfall? If we have a scenario where, there's a tight project deadline and we have the backend API already exists, but we're trying to create like a user feature. Sure enough, what we decide to do, especially as we're A/B testing something, we don't know how well this is going to do when we put it out in the real world, and we don't know if a huge investment is worth it. So the initial stages are when the UI sidesteps the mid-tier and directly reaches out to the backend API, makes a call, and then that's how they kind of enable whatever this new feature is that they wanted to enable. And sure enough, the A/B test did great. And now the product managers are like, when can we roll it out to everybody and fully productize this experience? And how quickly can we do this? Because here's the dollar amount associated with this feature. This is like an example of how your ideal state and your three-tiered architecture then starts to get diluted and the boundaries start dissolving, and then we deviate from the theoretical best practices in the real world. And this is something what I would call tech debt. Like, we've done this once.
Absolutely.
We've done this once, it's worked well, but what does it mean for maintenance? What does it mean for extending this feature from its V0 version to a V2 or a V3 that's even better? What does it mean for all of that? Is something that is often overlooked when you take a very short-term view. And I do want to say that at Netflix, we're pretty good at balancing the trade-offs, and engineers have a say. And a lot of the times, I feel like some of these challenges are not obvious for everybody. So if you are the sort of person that can kind of foresee the pitfalls or the downsides of a certain trade-off, I would encourage them to be vocal about it.
Two strains of conversation come to my mind when you say that, but one that's the most immediate to me is, do you find it easy, or do you find people being receptive when you say, yes, going directly from the front end to the back end with the middle tier is good for the moment, but this is going to cost us in the long term, and maybe we should do it now, but realize it's going to cost you? Are people receptive to that argument, or does the pressure of the constant, turnout functionality really force people not to think very clearly about this until it becomes unavoidable to do something about it?
It depends. It depends on the scenario. Maybe I'll give you an example of both cases. One example is, there is a new policy or like a regulation that's come out, and there's a strict deadline that, companies need to abide by to roll out the specific feature in order to continue operating. At that time, all bets are off. We're trying to get this out the door as quickly as possible. But even then, I feel like there is a level of due diligence that is important to be done, which is, in your proposal, call out the risks. It's like, hey, here, be explicit about the trade-offs that you're making and communicate and make sure that your stakeholders know that this is the trade-off that's been made, as opposed to silently make it and then being forced to eat the cost for it in the future.
Yes.
Nobody's heard about the fact that this trade-off was even made. So
Right.
that's one example. But in another case where, the PMs or even the leadership is very invested in a feature because they see it evolving into the future. They think that it's a big bet for the company and it's aligned with the long-term strategic priorities for the company. Then there's more room to negotiate of, hey, what is this V0 version going to be and how much of an investment we're going to make in that.
I think that's fair. And I guess it partially depends on how willing the engineers, which I think I've always done in my career, and I think it's very important to just state what is important, because the worst decisions I have found that are made are the decisions that get made by default
Yeah.
and where people don't realize that
Yeah.
they're making a decision.
And I want to add one more thing to that.
Yeah.
Sometimes people hate the messenger.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Yes.
so as engineers, it's important for you to have good relationships with all your cross-functional partners. And then it's hard to do that. Like, it starts from building the relationship, building some credit with that person to then be able to say that, hey, so you
Yes.
build up that credibility. So it's a long way to build up to when you can push back and bring up something like this.
I think that's an excellent point, because in the end, very often it's personal relationships that very often cause technical decisions to be made one way or the other. I mean, I often had an advantage as being consultant from the outside, being called in. Sometimes I got a little more leeway because I wasn't going to necessarily be there for the longest term to be a little more blunt. But even then, you have to be diplomatic. You have to care about people's feelings. The fact that someone may work on a feature that's been a long time and now you want to deprecate it, people are people at the end of the day.
Yeah. This reminds me of a common misconception that people have about the role of the architect, or even, the staff engineer role, is that they assume that it is a purely technical role. It is, but in my mind, it is also a leadership role where, your persuasion skills matter, your written communication matters, your ability to strategize and influence matters. Yeah, something to keep in mind.
A theme on these podcasts has been sort of Gregor Hope's elevator architect, where the architect has to be able to go from the boiler room to the boardroom and be able to communicate business requirements to the technical people and help the technical people understand that these business requirements are coming from real places and not because management woke up on a different side of the bed in the morning. Those are interpersonal skills. And I think too often people can, think of architects as enterprise architects that exist in some, on top of some mountain somewhere issuing edicts, and not the down in the depths of solution architects, the architects who have product responsibility, which is very much, as you say, almost as much personality as well as the technical chops. You need the both.
Totally.
Or you stay as an individual contributor. And, where technical chops matter more. I think people are more forgiving of someone who has technical expertise and being not the best personality than someone who's an architect,
The reverse.
Yeah.
I agree.
And of course, as we talked about before, sometimes if you have too much personality, you can be too convincing and be technically wrong. I'm sure we've all come across those people.
Sometimes it feels like, if you have the right kind of relationships and you're able to convince the right people, you get your way.
Yes. So I want to come back to the second thing, that when you were talking about the middle tier, and I found it very interesting what you were saying, what occurred to me is very often people want to think in terms of orchestration or choreography or event-driven solutions. Do you have any feeling about how to use those in the middle tier? Because the way you portray the middle tier, and I think it's valid, is That's the view that the front end has of the back end.
Yeah.
And it's the view that the back end has of the front end. This analogy just occurred to me. The back end is the raw cooking ingredients. The front end are sort of like the servers, the waiter, the waitresses.
Yeah.
And the middle tier is actually the cook, where the meal gets created.
That's a great analogy, because that reminds me of a state machine, where the state machine knows when to add an ingredient and
Yes.
how long to bake something and when to
Yes.
stir something and when to add the next ingredient. And some of it is driven by the feedback from the users from the front end, which is
Yes.
user initiated actions. But some others are driven by the response from the backend. Like, let's say we
Yes.
make a call to the backend API and it fails. Now the state machine is like, okay, what do I do when it succeeds versus what do I do when it fails? So definitely having a state machine is a good way to think about solving this specific example that you were talking about.
When I think about the middle tier, and I think of all the technologies and ideas that people have, state machines, choreography, orchestration, event driven, what is it that's most important to make the middle tier successful?
That is a great question, Michael. And, I feel like as engineers, we focus on enabling, like building to enable features and enable solving problems. And it's equally important to know when to get out of the way as well sometimes. So I feel like if you're working in the middle tier, looking at both of those aspects are equally important. How can we enable the UI to do something, but at the same time get out of the way when it is a presentation related concern? Another thing that I think of is like scaling the mid tier. So, for example, if you don't have a way to templatize some of the common interaction patterns between the UI and the mid tier, then you find yourself rebuilding very similar versions of interactions and how to handle those interactions over and over again, because you haven't invested the time to templatize that or make that component that you have in the mid tier more reusable. And another prerequisite for the mid tier to be successful would be the right level of abstraction at the back end. For example, if we've had premature consolidation of APIs at the back end, it becomes very difficult at the mid tier to be like, there's an API explosion because we have very specific APIs for different scenarios. So when do we use what? Ideally, we want to keep collaboration effective, but also at a minimum to do something new. So I feel like having the right level of abstractions at the back end is the third thing that I would say is a prerequisite for a successful mid-tier system.
That sounds in accordance with my experience as well. And when you talk about, the replication of efforts if things are not defined properly, you raise the question of scaling. And if you don't have the right middle tier, in other words, the middle tier has to scale as well as the back end appropriately. And where you scale what, as you say, you have to get the abstraction right.
And at Netflix, we have this engineering guiding principle that says build only when necessary. And I almost mapped that to Martin Fowler's rule of 3, where he says, hey, like refactor the third time you come across that, where, if you have 3 different scenarios that have like the same common interaction pattern, and now is a good time to kind of templatize that and abstract that away to be reused.
That makes a lot of sense. I wish I had some of this advice when I first got started many years ago, because, I remember as I started out with client server where there was no middle tier, and we watched this evolution and we've learned a lot of these principles the hard way. Hopefully people will take from this podcast, they don't have to make the same mistakes that we already made.
True. And I feel the same way. Like, I'm sure 5 years from now, I would wish that I knew more things than I did now. So that's a never ending cycle.
Well, but hopefully this is one of my motivations for liking to do these kinds of podcasts is to get people to focus on things, maybe while they're in their car or maybe they have free time, whenever they're listening to the podcast, to be exposed to something that puts something in their mind that says, hopefully, when they come across this, they don't have to rethink the problem from scratch and understand that people have shed blood and toil before them on these problems.
Definitely. And that's something that I feel like is more and more important as I progress in my career, is not just about learning from my own experiences,
Yes.
but maximizing my learnings by learning from other people's experiences.
That's a form of intellectual scale. Because if you can learn from other people's experiences, however you learn from them, you're scaling in a personal way, in personal experience. So there's an interesting segue to the other thing that I find very interesting about your work is we've talked about software improvement and technical depth and refactoring and renovation. And so that leads me to almost the question. And when you start out a software company is very small. As you said before, you just want to get things done.
Yeah.
And you don't think very carefully about the middle tier. You put just enough in the back end and the front rank to get your minimal viable product.
Yeah.
But then someday, hopefully, if you're successful and you have customers, so you just can't throw your old product away and start from scratch. How do you evolve your software? I mean, is it inevitable that you're going to have to reinvent things and start things over again? I guess it's the question that you've thought a bit about is, why are software migrations so difficult? They seem inevitable as the price of success, but is there anything we can do to make them easier?
You're right that it is inevitable, especially in companies that are successful and growing and expanding their scope and the range in which they operate. It is definitely inevitable. I think they are hard to get right for a few reasons. Because if you think about it, software migrations don't happen overnight. It takes the time that it takes, but you're also changing the plane while flying it. Because company priorities are constantly evolving. The world around is constantly evolving.
There's turbulence, you would say, as it could go with your analogy.
There totally is turbulence. That's one. The second thing is, as your company gets bigger and bigger, and as you add these layers, there is no one person that understands everything end to end. So now you're all individual experts in your own area, and you're trying to come together to see, hey, how do we go from where we are today to where we want to go? And often I would even consider it a success if we can even align on a common idea of where we want to go. Because even that's different sometimes and takes time to find the common ground.
Especially if the market is evolving quickly.
Yeah. And unlike traditional architect roles, in construction, where you plan your building end to end, like you have the whole plan and then you start building, that doesn't work for software engineering. Because your plan is just a direction. It's good to, get started and corral people and get us to move in the same way. But you quickly come across unknowns and challenges. And, you find out that this particular technology doesn't work exactly the way you thought it was going to.
Right.
Or, this other thing is important for you. Suddenly it's like, hey, security is now more important now versus previously we were just focused on performance. So the fact that surprises will come your way means that your migration process needs to stay nimble and evolvable, and you need to be able to pivot as and when you find issues that need to be solved. So that's the third thing that I think makes some of this challenging. The fourth reason why this is challenging is, yes, you're off to go build this new thing that will be great, when it's done, But hey, we still have product features that we want to innovate on and roll out. And there's this whole roadmap for the year that we still want to hit while we go do this other thing. So I view that as, how do we balance innovation with renovation? And is it a good idea to do both at the same time? Like, when are you going to start building product features in your new systems versus when do you want to still build that in your existing systems to kind of get it out the door sooner? And how do you isolate some of the changes? For example, let's say you rolled out a feature in your migration process and you're like, this is not doing as well as our previous product did. How do you even start pinpointing what went wrong? Is it because we have innovated upon it since and added new things, or is it because we changed the underlying technology as part of the migration? So isolating a regression becomes very challenging.
Do you ever see a situation? I mean, there are two things that come to mind when you say this, and I'll mention both of them, and then you can just sort of react as you want. One of them is that I often find that tools are not quite where you want them to be. Because unlike, for example, you mentioned before, architecture of buildings where people understand when you rip out a room, there's a cost to it. But on the other hand, there are civil engineers who can have the job of building the same bridge over and over again. The fact of the matter is, in software, we only do something because we want to do something new. I mean, if I want another copy of Microsoft Word, I just copy the bits.
Right.
So the problem is our tools are backwards facing. They're automating what we knew how to do yesterday, but not necessarily what we need to do tomorrow. I mean, you think of it how, people take for granted today with Java.net or any of the other, technologies that people use of having software libraries. For those of us who have been in the field for a while, realize it took decades for us to come up with enough common functionality, enough common areas to have libraries, debuggers, compilers. These were all invented at one point in time and were all very controversial when they were invented. So this is one tension that I see in sort of the software migration is the tools might not be there where we want to go. The other problem that comes to mind is, of course, the one of databases or stores. For example, if you're doing a migration, do you try to get the data model right first and then move both systems to the new data model and then evolve things? Or do you just create a new system and then migrate the backend at some point and cross your fingers and hope it all works?
Definitely not the latter.
Yes.
So if you have a data migration involved, definitely important to get the data model right. And even validation, like once you have the data model right, how can we know for a fact that we have a good way of comparing both the systems to validate that, hey, the new system actually does everything that we want to, and the way it responds to some of the queries are equivalent to what we used to have. And how do you kind of abstract that away from, say, impacting the UI in this case, or the consumers of that data? And you also have to plan around having both the new and the old systems be operational concurrently for a small period of time while you're switching over, because it's likely not a cut over at midnight situation as opposed
Which means you have to have back annotation going on.
Yeah. So you're likely dual writing in both for some time.
Yes.
And then validating using like dual reads, and then be like, okay, now I have confidence, so let me fully switch over and deprecate.
Right. I have never enjoyed those kinds of situations. It's one thing to have a new system and mess up, but when you mess up the old system in the process of moving to the new system, you don't win very many friends.
Oh, no, totally not. And regardless of how many times you do this, I feel like there's always a new challenge.
Yes.
Next time you do something that, you are having to solve from scratch.
Are there any things that pop up into your mind about what we've talked about or things that you want to explore? Before I move into what the architect's questionnaire that I like to ask everybody.
The one thing that I wanted to call out is, people sometimes have a tendency to hate on legacy systems. They're like, oh, this
Yes.
is old, this doesn't work the way I want it to, and this is built on old technology, and kind of forget the fact that that was maybe the breadwinning system, or it lets you do what you wanted to do. And there is something to be said for a system that's lasted a while, because incrementally, every month, every year, we've made improvements that is hard to get right by just switching to a rewrite and hey, let me do this thing again and expect it to be as stable or be as easily understandable as the old system that's been around for so long.
Somebody, I forget who it was, maybe it was David Chappell, I forget, said that the definition of a legacy system is a system that's making money now.
Yeah. Yes.
Which captures exactly what you've said. And I think it's very important because, yes, it's true that some systems do sort of live beyond their useful life, but people are still paying for them.
Mm-hmm.
They're paying your salaries and they're giving you the opportunity to do the next thing.
Yeah.
So I'd like to get to some of this. One of my favorite parts of the podcast is to get to humanize the architects that I have on and get a little more insight into what it means to be an architect. What is your favorite part of being an architect?
I will say, though, that there is never a dull moment, at work. I like the way my role challenges me and keeps me on my toes. And a big part of this is the variety that comes with the staff role at Netflix. The aspect of being an architect is definitely one facet of it, but it also includes other responsibilities like captaining, a large cross-functional project, kind of like a tech lead, for example. And I like the ability to switch focus every once in a while and have that breadth of avenues to hone my skills against.
What is your least favorite part of being an architect?
Oof. I think increasingly we've grown to expect, maybe I'm speaking for myself here, I'll say I have grown to expect, fast feedback loops for effort and reward and instant gratification, which is what we have with, technology now. But it is that kind of instant gratification is hard to come by in an architect or a staff role, because the feedback loop, if you think about it, the feedback loop for effort to then seeing the impact of your effort come to life only goes up,
Yes.
as you move up the ladder. So the feedback loop has gone from being days, when you're discovering a bug and putting a fix out, to months when you're, say, leading a project, or to quarters and years in the staff role. So it takes the time that it takes for your impact to be visible, and it requires a level of patience that I currently do not have, but I'm working towards building that muscle.
Well, I look, patience is something you can learn, but it takes a lot. It took me a lot of time for me to learn patience, because there's something intoxicating about programming a computer, because you get it works or it doesn't work. The algorithm, and even if you take some time to get it, you get that instant feedback or gratification that it works or doesn't work.
Yeah.
And with being an architect, even the negative feedback that you want, so you learn, and sometimes it doesn't get there in time for you to stop the mistake.
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. This resonates with me. And Michael, it's encouraging to know that I have a future in which I will be able to get the level of patience I need.
Yes. Is there anything creatively, spiritually, or emotionally compelling about architecture or being an architect?
I think the role requires you to not just focus on your contributions at an individual level, but also think about the influence and impact that you can have by enhancing the productivity and effectiveness of like those around you. So your radius of impact then kind of goes beyond your own work as you empower others to achieve more. And we call that the multiplier effect internally. So that's something that I find compelling about the role.
What turns you off about architecture or being an architect?
When something is obviously flawed to me, but is not as obvious to others, I find that to be like a frustrating situation to be in sometimes, because I'm like, here I am spending time on like trying to convey the problem where this time could have been spent towards, solutioning the problem. And I think that's primarily because I have a bias for action, which has served me well in the past. There's no denying that. But I feel like right now, I find that getting in the way sometimes. So I'm working on changing my perspective and telling myself sometimes that the way I add value is different from how it was in the past.
Yes, I certainly feel that way, especially the further you get from actually touching code. You just have to accept the fact that somebody who has not been down the road you've been down sometimes just has to learn from their own experience.
Yep.
Do you have any favorite technologies?
Is this like asking if you have a favorite child, Michael? No, jokes aside though, I view technology as a means to an end.
Okay.
And we spoke about this earlier too. Like, it's important to pick the right tool set to solve
Right.
your problem. So sometimes I feel like being attached to a technology doesn't serve me well, because then I have a bias that keeps me from picking something that might be right for the problem or the scenario that we're trying to solve. Though, if your question was reverse, I did have an answer. Like, if you did ask me, do I have a technology that I dislike?
Well, that's good. I have two questions from now. I'll ask you that. Or maybe I'll ask it now. What technologies do you hate?
This I have an answer only because of a bad experience in the past. So I actually dislike Scala. I think it's a great language if you're trying to do data processing or like data oriented things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think back when I was at Uber, my tech lead at the time made the decision that we were going to write a data serving app in Scala. And the reason was, hey, we'll have succinct code. And that was true. We did have, our classes were much smaller than they would have been in, say, Java, even Python. But it was so unreadable. Like, it's like a single line that would do 10 lines worth of stuff in, Python or Java. And added to the fact that at Uber, while Go, Java, and Python were considered first class programming languages that had support, Scala wasn't one of them. So we had to kind of solve some of our like deploy challenges and like operational challenges ourselves that made it even worse. So ever since then, I have a bias against Scala.
Yeah, but you also raise an interesting question, because I was always, when I wrote code, sort of thought of code as sort of an expository literature, which should be clear that one step comes after another, and it's sort of, you're making a technical challenge. In fact, Knuth wrote a very famous essay. I know if people are familiar with the computer scientist Knuth, who invented TAP, and he wrote an essay on literate programming. It's a very famous essay. You really should read it. It talks about the importance of code clarity. Because the thing you have to realize is code is more often read than it's written.
Oh, yeah.
Because you write code, you forget about it, but many other people will look at your code.
Yeah.
And try to figure out what you did. So if you're writing concise code that no one else can understand, I don't think you're doing the maintenance programmers,
any favors.
A great job.
Yeah.
Which also leads to one of my dislikes of people who write comments, but the comments don't get evolved as the code changes. I have been misled more than once in my career by reading comments, thinking this is what the code does. And then when I actually read the code and figure out what's going on, no, that's not what the code does.
And this is assuming documentation exists in the first place.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why you want to write readable code, because very often the code is the best documentation.
True. And I feel like the other thing that I've heard, and I think that's true, is too, code lives longer than you think it's going to live for when you're writing it.
That was a saying that was around when I was doing programming. It does. Sometimes it lives longer than you at the company.
Oh, totally. Like there are a lot of times when I look up Git blame and I'm like, who is this person?
Yes. Sometimes you don't always have the nicest feelings about that person.
And then that leaves me wondering what people are going to think about me after I leave,
Yes. What about architecture do you love?
I definitely enjoy the problem solving aspect, which is, both challenging and rewarding at the same time. I also like the 1,000-foot view that you sometimes are forced to take to, then understand the big picture, put all the pieces together and peel back the layers of the onion one by one to then gather the context that you need to go back and think about how to solve a problem.
What about architecture do you hate?
This is easy. Context switching. So there's like two types of context switching. One is switching between topics. Like sometimes you're like going from this fire to this other fire. And sometimes you're like, as you said in the elevator example of like going from the boardroom to the boiler room where you're zooming in and zooming out pretty constantly. And it takes me some time to kind of reorient myself. So I end up dedicating a day to this and then the next day to that, versus if I try to switch between multiple topics on a single day, then I find that I'm very ineffective.
I'll tell you a little secret as somebody who's been in this business for a while. It gets harder as you get older.
Oh, wow. I'm glad I have heads up, so I know what to expect.
What profession other than being an architect would you like to attempt?
This one is interesting because when I think of, profession, I'm like, oh, it has to be something I enjoy. And then I think about, okay, what do I enjoy? Mm-hmm. I really enjoy dancing, specifically Indian classical dancing. But I've never pursued it professionally before. So, maybe that'll be my answer. But I'll also be wary of the whole losing your hobby by turning it into a profession thing.
Yes.
So I hope that doesn't happen to me.
Do you ever see yourself not being an architect anymore?
In the short term, no. But in the long term, yes. Like, I don't think I want to retire in my current role. And with, Gen AI, it does make you think. It's like, can human architects and staff engineers be replaced with a Gen AI product? TBD. It's, remains to be seen.
I wouldn't worry about it too much for your generation. Maybe the next generation.
Yeah.
But I think, first of all, we don't understand really how Gen AI actually works.
True.
And as you well know, the Gen AI architect will utter truth and stupidity with the same degree of competence.
True.
And if you look at most of the successes in artificial intelligence, and I hate using artificial intelligence, is really in focused applications of machine learning where you have good data and qualified data, and that's where the successes are. And people tend to extrapolate that to Gen AI, which I think is false.
Fair.
So I think for the next 10, 15 years, maybe I'm wrong. I don't think you have to worry about it. Maybe beyond that, as people come to grips with the problems of LLMs, in fact, I was working with ChatGPT this morning, and I still found that I had to really revise my prompts over and over again
Yeah,
because there are things that would have been obvious to you in having a conversation between the two of us. I had to really still explicitly tell the LLM.
that's fair. And
Yeah.
maybe this is just a sign of, me overestimating
Yes.
the impact of Gen AI in the short term. But I know that humans also have a tendency to underestimate impact in the long term. So,
Correct. Absolutely. I mean, there are some people who have some good ideas on how to proceed in this area, but
yeah.
really, I think we're slowly reaching a dead end with
Mm,
pure LLMs.
yeah,
And we're going to need some other trick to get to where we need to be because these models don't understand the real world very well.
fair.
I mean, think of it this way. That was the third thing I said about when I would, do software consulting is get your clients to tell you what you want.
Mm,
There's so much ambiguity that you
yeah,
have to tease out with requirements or even doing algorithms that LLMs just don't understand now.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Encouraging.
Yes. Well, okay, all right. And the final question I like to ask is, when a project is done, what do you like to hear from the clients or your team?
This is a great question. And, it's, of course, basically all the usual stuff is like, hey, well executed, well done. But what I would really want is for our clients to walk away with the feeling that they trust the processes that were behind the successful execution of a project, starting from, hey, this way of gathering requirements and validating the needs of the users worked well, let's use this. The fact that we did a pre-mortem to understand the risks, that was valuable. Let's keep doing that. The way we identified milestones and spread out the initiative, that process was effective. And how we tested and added observability and like rolled out and added all the safety features, like that was like I would want the clients to walk away with the feeling that they trust that the success is replicable and not just focus on the fact that, hey, this one initiative was successful. So that then they keep coming back and then you build that long-term trust with them.
I really enjoyed doing this podcast very much. You're very engaging, also very honest, as we talked about things. I want to thank you very much for being willing to be on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Michael.